That's what the actions of Conrad Murray did. Not just to Michael Jackson, but to his children. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant is charged with one single count of involuntary manslaughter for the criminal negligence that was exhibited and caused the death of Michael Jackson. I want to talk to you briefly about the law and the applicability of the law in this case. The law as it relates to involuntary manslaughter. And I want you to remember, if you look back, whenever it was, 6 weeks ago or thereabouts, when I stood in this very well, and we were going through voir dire, and I discussed with each and every one of you. I said, you may have unanswered questions at the end of this trial. There may be 100 questions, and maybe 97 of them are left unanswered. But under the law, you need only answer just 3. I asked each and every one of you, are you the type of juror that could do that? Are you the type of juror that could follow the law, recognize that you have an extremely important role, but also a limited role, to answer the questions presented by the law? And I asked you, in all candor, are you the type of juror that would just be frustrated? You need to answer everything or you cannot reach a verdict. And each and every one of you assured me that you would be able to follow the law, determine the facts, apply the law, and answer what needs to be answered under the law. And should that mean that you leave here with unanswered questions, you would still be able to fulfill your obligation. Now, involuntary manslaughter, as the court read to you, there are 2 separate theories. And the reason there are 2 separate theories in this unique case is because Conrad Murray, the defendant, is a medical doctor. And as an everyday, for lack of a better word, civilian, you are liable under involuntary manslaughter for acts of gross negligence. As a doctor, however, the law recognizes this special relationship. And the law states that a doctor has a legal duty of care, such that if a doctor fails to act, a doctor is also criminally liable under involuntary manslaughter. So where a non-doctor may not be liable under that theory, a doctor is recognized by the law as having this additional obligation to have a legal duty of care to his patient. And that a failure to act, a failure to live up to that legal duty of care, also subjects the person to criminal liability under involuntary manslaughter. So the law states that a defendant committed a lawful act, but acted with criminal negligence. And the defendant's act caused, in other words, was a substantial factor in the death of Michael Jackson. The act being that the defendant, a licensed physician, administered propofol and the surrounding criminal negligence in the administration of that propofol. But that is the act that inevitably led to the death of Michael Jackson. Now, as a legal doctor, the defendant has a legal duty to Michael Jackson and failed to perform that legal duty. The failure to perform the legal duty was criminally negligent, and his failure to perform that legal duty caused, again, substantial factor, it need only be more than trivial or remote, caused the death of Michael Jackson. And that is because a physician who has assumed the responsibility to treat and care for a patient has a legal duty to treat and care for that patient. Criminal negligence. A person acts with criminal negligence when he acts in a reckless way that creates a high risk of death or great bodily injury. And a reasonable person would have known that acting in that way would create such a risk. In other words, a person acts with criminal negligence when the way he acts is so far different from the way an ordinarily careful person would act in the same situation, that his act amounts to a disregard for human life or an indifference to the consequences of that act. Now that is criminal negligence. What criminal negligence is not is an intentional desire to kill. It is not an intentional desire to cause harm. No one has sought to prove that Conrad Murray sought to kill Michael Jackson. This is a criminal negligence theory, that he acted so recklessly with the life of Michael Jackson in his hands that it amounts to indifference to the very life of Michael Jackson. Causation. An act or failure to perform a legal duty causes death if the death is the direct, natural, and probable consequence of the act or failure to perform a legal duty, and the death would not have happened without the act or failure to perform the legal duty. A natural and probable consequence is one that a reasonable person would know is likely to happen if nothing unusual intervenes. An act or failure to perform a legal duty causes death only if it is a substantial factor in causing the death. And here again the definition. A substantial factor is more than a trivial or remote factor. However, it does not have to be the only factor that causes death. Conrad Murray's actions need only rise to more than a trivial or remote factor in causing the death of Michael Jackson for there to be criminal liability under involuntary manslaughter. Now, you've heard throughout the trial, through the defense opening statements, through the defense medical expert, Dr. White, that their theory to date is that Michael Jackson injected himself with propofol, causing his own death. Well, the law accounts for this scenario as well. And what this is called under the law is independent intervening cause. To relieve a defendant of criminal liability, an intervening cause must be unforeseeable and an extraordinary occurrence. Defendant remains criminally liable for the death if the possible consequence might reasonably have been contemplated, or the defendant should have foreseen the possibility of the harm of the kind that could result from his act. We will talk about this more, but you need only go to defendant Conrad Murray's own statement, where he states his own belief and knowledge that Michael Jackson liked to push propofol himself, that he liked to do it himself. You take Conrad Murray's own statements and you cannot, under any rational interpretation of the facts, conclude, if you believe that theory, that it was unforeseeable or is not an expected consequence when the patient is left by himself, abandoned, with benzodiazepines and propofol running through his blood. If you believe that theory, Conrad Murray, in his own words, told you it was a foreseeable consequence and that he is guilty as a substantial factor in causing Michael Jackson's death. Another instruction of importance, the evaluation of the defendant's statements. If you find that the defendant made a false or misleading statement before this trial relating to the charged crime, knowing the statement was false or intending to mislead, that conduct, that false or misleading statement, may show he was aware of the guilt of his crime, and you may consider it in determining his guilt. The fact that Conrad Murray would not tell the paramedics that he administered propofol and had been administering propofol for over 2 months, a fact that Dr. White incredulously described as something that was overlooked, that is a false, misleading statement. That is consciousness of guilt. That is Conrad Murray knowing full well what caused Michael's death. That is Conrad Murray not putting the patient first. That is Conrad Murray putting Conrad Murray first. And that is consciousness of guilt. Showing the defendant knew what had transpired. He knew of his guilt, and he was intentionally giving false and misleading statements. But as you well know, it didn't stop with the paramedics. He then continued with the emergency room doctors, never once mentioning propofol, only mentioning lorazepam. These are false, intentionally false, misleading statements when Conrad Murray, as you well know, was fully aware of what had transpired in that room, was fully aware of the information that he had an obligation as a doctor to share, and Conrad Murray failed to share that information. That is consciousness of guilt. Now, let's talk briefly about the background of this case and the background of what was going on at this time. And it will not be a lengthy discussion because I think all of you are quite familiar with the surrounding circumstances of this case and what was transpiring. But again, we know Conrad Murray had had signed an employment contract, the parties being AEG, Michael Jackson, and Conrad Murray. He had signed it, however, neither of the other parties had signed it. But we know what Conrad Murray expected to receive. What he expected to receive for his services was $150,000 a month, at least for the 10-month duration of the tour, and possibly longer. What he hoped to get for his services rendered was $150,000 a month. In a trip to London and housing in London, because again, this contract was written up and its sole purpose was for the tour, the desire of Michael Jackson to have Conrad Murray as his doctor on this tour in London. We know of Conrad Murray's intent. We know of his desire as evidenced by the fact that he had already signed the contract, and as further evidence by the fact that he had already sent out letters to all of his patients telling them that he was taking a sabbatical because of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I had to make a most difficult decision to cease practice of medicine indefinitely. Indefinitely. This is the letter Conrad Murray sent out to his patients. He was ceasing medicine. He hit the lottery. He was going to get $150,000 a month. And he was taking it wherever it was going to take him. If it took him to Los Angeles, if it took him to London, this is what Conrad Murray was going to do. He sent out letters to all of his patients and said, I am ceasing the practice of medicine. Now, you've heard a lot about propofol, and I just want to go over a couple things briefly. Again, it's an intravenous sedative hypnotic. It's used for the induction and maintenance of anesthesia or sedation. You know where it's used, you know when it's used, and you know why it's used. What I want to talk about are the shipments and the quantity and the knowledge of Conrad Murray as these shipments continued. As these huge volumes of propofol were being shipped and continued all throughout the months, including June of 2009. We know they were all shipped to Nicole Alvarez's apartment, not to a medical office, not to a medical clinic, as Conrad Murray had relayed to Tim Lopez. but to an apartment building. Left to be signed for by Nicole Alvarez, whoever else may have picked up the package.